Hey, I'm trying to schedule my plane tickets in the holiday recess. When you buy them early, it's cheaper. And we don't have anything in the final week, right?
We in the finals week we don't, but we have the last lecture. Yes, like it's yes.
On the calendar, but I wanted to double check.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hello.
I'm not overly familiar with it because I haven't done GitHub. When you add assignments and stuff,
yeah,
you issue pull requests as well.
No, we just
I'm not seeing them.
No. So what we do is we just upload them, kind of, and then there's two ways you can do it, right? You can either do what I'm describing in this tutorial, that you can kind of like have one repository. Like I might not be getting into it today, but you can essentially do the fancy stuff by pulling the changes and then having this all in your repository, or you can just like click the download button, right, and then you get the files. And for the homeworks, that is sufficient. For the projects, you might want to like collaborate with your team, and then you might want to use some of the features of Git and GitHub, but you have time to get into that.
Because I clone the repository to a cloud storage specific site. So
yeah.
So I just use that.
Sure, that works.
Thanks.
Absolutely. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Let's get started for today. Today we'll have our first technical lecture. It's going to be like a basic introduction to HTML and CSS. If we have extra time, which I suspect we won't, it will be. I will also talk a little bit about Git, but maybe show of hands, who has not yet written, let's say, more than a couple of lines of HTML code? Okay, there's a few people in here. Great. Who knows what CSS grids are? Maybe let's ask the other way. Who doesn't know what CSS grids are? Okay, so we have roughly half-half. So I hope there's something interesting for you all in here, but this is going to be like a fairly basic lecture. As you know, there's like a very diverse set of students in this class. And so I want to kind of like, get everybody on board so that we can all create visualizations together. The other thing that will be happening in these technical lectures, we'll be using this website, this sub-website of our course website that you can reach if you go to datavizcourse.net/tutorials. There you can follow along, and this is all interactive. So if you want to try out how something works, you can like type directly like in a code pen, right, and you will see the result immediately. That's true for everything except for the bash commands for Git. But most of the stuff we'll be looking at today will be like that. Okay, before we get started, any administrative questions? Sounds not like it. Okay, well, let's start with the tutorial here on HTML. So HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. And basically, HTML is the basic language we use to write content for the web. Back when this was invented in the 90s, it was really meant as like a document format, right? And so this is like a markup language. And so back then, we would have, papers like a whatever university library website or something like that, or a restaurant website would develop an HTML page, and then you could visit and you could see some information and you can maybe see some links there that kind of builds up the internet. Nowadays, HTML is really more of like a, like one of the pieces of the language that we use for building applications on the web. We've kind of like moved away from this websites being pure documents to websites really like web apps being really like the way we do most of our work nowadays, right? So I like use Gmail, for example, as my email client. I use Keynote as opposed to Google Slides, but you can use Google Docs or Google Spreadsheets and so on. All of these are like web-based applications. And many visualization tools nowadays also work on the web. And of course, the web has many advantages compared to desktop applications. Mostly like it's easy to deploy, it's easy to use, right? But it also has some disadvantages. And one of the disadvantages of them is that we have to use some legacy technology like HTML and also to some parts JavaScript. But it turns out that HTML has become actually pretty cool. Back when I started working with HTML, it was fairly like, weird to write, had a lot of quirks. And now it's getting better and better. And that's especially true also for JavaScript and then kind of like derivatives like TypeScript. So in HTML5, you can do as I said, applications, but you can do graphics or audio and video, and you have native support of vector graphics, and we'll make use of many of those things. And so the basic thing about HTML is like this is what markup text looks like, and this is the result here. So what we have here is this XML style dialect that we have some kind of element or a tag that opens up something that applies to the stuff that is between this opening and the closing tag. And then we have the closing tag here. So like we have these like brackets, the strong that tells us what this element does. And what this element does here is it makes this like it renders this strong. And so if I remove this here, you can see that this is now not strong or bold anymore. But if I type in italic, you will see that it is actually turns italic, right? So that's the idea of elements. So this is like the very, very simplest HTML that you can do. Typically, we have elements that are closing, like opening and closing. Like in the strong one, we had an opening tag and the closing tag. But some tags, you actually don't need closing tags. So a good example of a tag that doesn't need a closing tag is a break, like a line break. So like the BR tag here, for example, is one that doesn't have an equivalent closing tag. Like what would a closing line break look like, right? This doesn't make much sense. Similarly, like an image tag, if you want to include an image or if you want to include an SVG, it's like that, right? So the image tag doesn't have a closing tag, but it does have attributes, and we'll talk about attributes a little bit later. Now it's totally legal to use like break or image without a closing tag. Before HTML5, this was actually not good practice because back then it was still an XML language. It's not anymore. And back then, you always had to have a closing tag, and there were two versions of doing this. You could actually write opening BR, closing BR, or you could write the self-closing tag, actually, yeah, this is kind of like weird to see because of the line break here, but this example with the foo here. So you have kind of like the opening bracket, then you have the element name, then you have the closing like slash, and then you have the closing bracket. But you don't have to bother about this, but just in case you see this in some older code, that is what is going on there. So HTML elements do nest, and this is very common. You'll see these deep hierarchies of HTML appear whenever you actually write HTML or generate HTML. So here, for example, I have the first part of the sentence here is, or the whole part of this is strong. And then we have this middle part here, which I'm also underlining here. So you can see this is strong and this is underlined. So clearly we can nest these elements, and the things that are in this nested element, like both the underline and the strong apply to it. And then one thing that's super important is attributes. In addition to kind of like what's the name of the element and what's between the closing and the opening and the closing tag, we have the attributes. And so we use this, for example, in an anchor tag. And an anchor tag is actually, like, historically it's called an anchor tag. Nowadays it's really just a link tag, right? Whenever you want to add a link to a document, you do this with the A tag, and you specify the destination of the link with href, hypertext reference, which does make sense. And then you put in the URL that you want to link to. And that can be like a fully qualified URL or some relative URL. And so here you see that this link to the School of Computing, and that works just fine, right? Like I can open this and I can do this in here. Great. So notice that these attributes can be specified with like a single or with a double quote, but you can't mix it, right? So if I have a double quote in here and a single quote to close it, what the browser actually thinks what's happening is that I forgot to close it, right? So it tries to find the matching quote, in this case, a double quote, and so nothing here happens. If I replace this with a double quote, we'll see that the link immediately reappears. Okay, so the other thing that is useful, like another attribute that you often see, is the title attribute. The title attribute is kind of like the tooltip, or reveals more information. So as I hover over it, it's maybe a little bit hard to read here because the tooltip doesn't zoom in, but you can see that there's more information that is provided on this tooltip as I hover over it. And so you can do this very easily like this. And there's other important attributes, especially today. We'll be using the ID, the class, and the style attributes. So like the ID attribute is essentially letting your element be uniquely identified. So this is like a global variable. I can say, here is my div or my strong element, and I want to give this a name because I maybe want to style this one particular element, or I want to later programmatically access it, and then I give it a unique name. Similarly, a class element is one that tells me something is of that type, right? So that's usually also used for styling, but can also be used for programmatically accessing the elements. And so be careful with IDs. You should use each ID really only once, and generally you should also be wary. If you use too many IDs, something might be wrong, right? It's totally fine if you have a header of your page that you call header with an ID because you have it only once. But if you have, for example, a table of elements, you shouldn't be using an ID element, but you should be trying to access these elements in the table a little bit differently. And so the other thing that HTML contains, which I haven't shown so far, is this is just the basic markup code, but in reality, an HTML file does contain some metadata. And that metadata essentially are these elements here. So we have the HTML tag, which essentially tells the browser that they're expecting an HTML file. And then we have the header tag, the head, which is used for example, the title page. So for example, this whole visualization on the web tutorial that you see up here in the browser tab, that is specified in the header. Or we can add scripts, or we can add meta information in the header. Meta information is, for example, used if you, nowadays, if you paste a link from any website on, let's say, Twitter, you will actually see a succinct description of this website and a nice photo. And of course, this doesn't come from Like this doesn't magically appear, but somebody who built that website has thought about this and has specified what this page should look like if you paste the link. And they do this by using, for example, meta tags. Script tags allow you to write JavaScript code. And that's what we'll be using a lot. You can either write script directly in your HTML file, or you can write it in a separate file and link to it. Similarly, style files, like HTML is really meant to be like a markup in the sense of the structure of the document, but the appearance shouldn't be changed. And so in the HTML file. And so when we want to change the appearance is where we use CSS. And we'll be talking about CSS today. And the reason why we want to separate this, because very likely nowadays you want to target your appearance to the client of the user, right? So you might want to have a completely different appearance for a website that people visit with their computer as opposed to a website that visit with their phone, right? So and you can do this with CSS. You can look at the device parameters. And so you can nicely separate content from styling and can do all of the styling for your mobile or for your computer with CSS. Here's an example of how I reference an external document to include in an HTML page. So for example, here I'm including a style sheet. There's I have some type information here, and then here I'm specifying exactly the location of that file. So the rel attribute here defines the relationship of the active document. The type attribute tells the browser which type of file to expect. And then body is really where everything else happens, right? So here, this is kind of the basic, the very minimal HTML document, or the almost very minimal HTML document that is a valid independent HTML document looks something like this. I have some, the header, the HTML tag, the doc type thing here, and then I have the body, and the body is really all that I see, right? So this is what is rendered, and everything else here just appears like this, okay? And by the way, sometimes it's useful if you want to just look at this page in isolation. There's always the C output in a new page here. And so you can look up what this actually looks like in a browser. And so this is maybe the most boring website ever created, but it is a website. Great. So here's a little bit more content. And let's first look at what the output is of this document. So we have a paragraph, we have an image included, and then we have headings defined, like HTML. H1 to H6 headers, and then and so on. And so let's look at the code here. So we have our kind of header that we kind of mostly skip over. Then we start our body. In the body, we have a paragraph. So one thing that you should never do is just write plain text inside of a body, right? Text always belongs in some container. It belongs either in a paragraph or in some div or in a span. It needs to be kind of associated with some other element. Of course, it's still going to work. One thing that's interesting about HTML, unless other programming languages, and that's also true to some degrees for JavaScript, it just tries to execute the most egregious sins that you can make. The browser might still render it, right? Because back in the day, there was different standards, and the browser was simply doing the best they could. But you can kind of validate, and I'll talk about this at some point. But you should essentially write valid and good HTML code, because it's going to make your life easier. So here we have another paragraph, and this paragraph actually uses the break tag, and you can see that here is actually the result of that break tag. Then we include an image. We say image source, and in this case, it's a Utah logo that we integrate from with a fully qualified URL, and it's an SVG, so a vector graphic. This is also something that we'll be using a lot, SVGs, and that's also something that's not 10 years ago, SVGs weren't widely supported in browsers. And then here we have the alt tag. The alt tag gives us a brief description about what is in that image. And this is super important to always include, and to kind of also invest a little bit of thinking in what you want to include in that alt tag, because people who use screen readers, of course, can't see images, right? And for them to be able to access the website, they use the alt tags, and they get a succinct description of the content of that image. Then we have here another paragraph. Notice that kind of line breaks, and so that things like that I do in HTML, they don't actually appear in the output. So for example, you can see that this is important for screen reader usage. This is broken up here in a new line, but this doesn't appear in HTML, right? This is kind of because I don't have an explicit break tag, it just doesn't appear here. And if I add more than one space, it doesn't appear. So you have to use specific markup or styling for that. And then here we have headings. H1 is the heading of level 1, the most important heading of a document. And then at second level, we have H2. And you can keep doing this until H6. And then the other thing that is often useful is comments. As in most programming and markup languages, you can write comments. And you can do this with this like exclamation mark dash dash tag here. And everything that's in between here is a comment. OK. So another data structure or other data structures that are useful are lists and tables. Let's look at them first again. So here we have like lists. We have two different types of lists, ordered lists and unordered lists. So are they enumerated or are they not enumerated, just bullets? And then we have tables. But let's talk first about the list. So we have kind of like the OL tells us the OL element is an ordered list element. So this means it's an enumerated list. And then we have these various elements. And note that I don't have to specify the number here, that is automatically generated. So it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I have to close the list element. And again, like as I said earlier, HTML tends to be very forgiving. So here, for example, I forgot the closing tags, even though I should be using them. But this still appears in here, right? So you should be using the closing tag, but the browser might still be rendering it if it is not in there. And for an unordered list, it works exactly the same way. But instead of ordered list, OL, you use UL for unordered list. And that's the whole trick. Tables are slightly more complicated, but not so much. Here, I'm actually doing something that I just said you shouldn't do. I'm showing like some styling for the table. Like I'm saying border is 1 so that we can actually see that this is a table. So you can do that, but you typically shouldn't do that. It's kind of like OK for debugging purposes, right? But typically what you want to is like do the styling of your table with CSS later. And then in the table, you specify like the table tag. And then you have you specify a table row by row. And each row gets a TR element. So that's table row. And in the TR elements, you put in either TH or TD elements. So TH stands for table header, and TD stands for table data. And so these are the cells, right? So I specify by TR how many rows I have. And then implicitly, by the number of TDs or THs, I specify how many columns I have. So fairly straightforward. If I add, let's say, a third TH in here, the third column will appear, and it will just not have any data for that particular cell here. So if I have like an inconsistent number of table data or table headings, some of them will just be empty. OK. So one thing that's also fairly new in HTML is that we have now semantically meaningful elements. So like a couple of years ago, if we wanted to structure an HTML page, and this is still fairly common, we mostly use these diff elements. And diff elements are dividers. These are kind of like empty containers, and they really become useful when you kind of like programmatically access them, or when you style them, or when you give them classes and so on, right? So they help you structure your code, but they don't actually have any meaning. And so we had these diff and the span element, and the difference between those two is a diff is a kind of like a block element. So that means it would essentially make a line break. So if you have two diffs after each other, like one would be on top, the other one would be at the bottom. A span is similar to a diff in many ways. It doesn't have any inherent meaning, but it doesn't do a line break. And so, for example, if you want to have like a part of a sentence that you want to partially style, maybe make the color of a sentence red, you could start off like, here's my regular text, then I have my span element, then I have the text that I style in red, and the span element actually won't break the line, right? So it is kind of like an element that you can use if you want to avoid a line break. Of course, you can influence all of this with CSS later. In addition to diff, we now have semantically meaningful elements. And they kind of like do the same thing, but they have other names. So like, for example, an article, a section, a footer, a nav, and so on, they are kind of like, technically, they're the same thing as a diff, but they're still useful for you to structure your website. So for example, if you have write like a website that posts that generates blogs, you would put the blog post into an article tag, right? And then you would have an author tag, and then you might have like a section tag, and then your website might have a footer tag, and you would put your navigation into the nav tag and so on. And this is useful, of course, for everybody who writes this code to structure it, but it's also especially useful for accessibility, right? Because essentially, like a screen reader or like accessibility software more generally, like if you want to navigate, like if we see this page, we kind of know where the nav is. But if the screen reader or the accessibility software does also understand where the nav is, it's easier to kind of like use. OK, so here is an example. So here's some structured HTML. I'm starting off with a nav. So if you have any navigation links, they would go inside this nav tag. And then you have like a main tag. This is where we start with the main content. Then I would write my heading 1. And then I would write like a section here, some content in the section. Then here I would use a division. Like this isn't necessarily kind of like elegant, but possible, right? Then I can do a line break. And then here I have a span. And so this is the point about the span that I said earlier. The span here, like notice that at the end of element comma, I'm ending the span and I'm starting another span. But this doesn't really appear as a broken line here either, right? So if I had a div here, this would be a line break. I would have a separate container. Because I have a span here, I don't have it. OK. And then the last thing I want to talk about for HTML itself is forms. And so forms are these kind of like widgets that we use to elicit interaction and to record interaction from a user. Strictly speaking, I can make any element on an HTML page interactive nowadays, and this is also very common to do nowadays. But still, whenever you can use a form, you should use a form. And in forms, we have elements such as like text fields, text areas, sliders, and then submit buttons, and so on, right? And so whenever you want a slider, you could, in theory, implement a slider from scratch, but it's probably much easier to just use that slider because it has the right events immediately exposed, and so on. And so how do we create this? Well, we have the forms that consist of an enclosing form tag, and that may contain input, text areas, and label tags. And so, for example, here, this form has like a label for demo text field, and then I can enter the text. This is like the label for, like, notice that this demo text field here, that's the ID of that input element, right? So like now I have this association with, this is the label for that particular text field. And then I can give it a default value. And so you can see this is my default text here, but of course, this is like meant to be edited. And then, and here's another example. I have a text area, and I'm again specifying what this is labeled for. Enter long text is for the long text area, which I specify here by ID. And here I can use multiple paragraphs. And then I close the text area. And then here I have a slider. Again, the label for the slider and I have like a type input type range. I give it this IDs that kind of like hooks up with this label here. Then I give it a name. And then I specify it goes from min 0 to max 10, right? And then what we'll later do is, for example, we could, like with JavaScript, we could read out the value of the slider and print that value here. And we'll be doing this kind of stuff in the next lecture on Thursday. OK, any questions so far about HTML elements or anything like that? Yeah. So there should be, like if you don't put them inside a form, they might still work. But it will depend on the browser. And there might be some. There is also, like, when you submit a form, you typically get some post event later. And if you have all of this neatly in the form, then you will get this post event in a well-defined manner. Yep. That's actually a good question. I don't exactly know what the name. The ID here is this kind of global identifier that I can use like any element, right? This is like for any particular tag, for any element, I can specify an ID. And the name here is something specific to that input element. And I think, oh yeah, the answer to this is it. Well, I would have to look it up, but essentially this is somewhere in the specification of input. I am assuming this just has a name. So we can Google this, and like one thing that I would generally recommend, if you Google something on HTML, CSS, or JavaScript, you should always add MDN to your query, because this gets you to the Mozilla Developer Network, which is probably the best documentation for web stuff out there. And so input form name. So now we can look up the input element, and this is like more or less the reference documentation. And now we would look up what does actually name do. Name, the name for the control submitted with the form as part of the name value pair. So the answer to the question is that this is something that when I post this later, I can kind of like computationally extract it based on this name. Okay. Yeah. Yes, I'll be talking about this in a future lecture. What I would recommend is that you use Visual Studio Code. If you don't have another preference for an editor, right? There's many editors. People might have strong opinions about editors, but Visual Studio Code is a free editor that, like, I think most of my PhD students also use. It's pretty comprehensive. And in Visual Studio Code, you can open up an HTML page. Let's say I'll open up something from that we'll have a little bit later here. So, okay, this one here, and then I can simply click run and then start debugging, and then this will open up a Chrome browser and it will show this page, right? And so here you can edit the code. You have all of the support for that you expect from an IDE, and then you can run it very easily. But I'll be talking about this a little bit more at some later point. Okay, great. So one thing that we've kind of like implicitly done so far is, we've created HTML and then the browser does something and it creates this page. And so it's important to understand first, what is a DOM? This is also, by the way, a favorite exam question. Explain the difference between the DOM and the HTML. So the DOM is the document object model. And so the DOM is kind of like the representation of the page as the browser sees it. In the case of like a simple HTML page without any JavaScript, those two things actually look identical, right? So the HTML page and the DOM are the same thing. But if I take HTML and manipulate it dynamically, then the DOM changes. So the DOM is kind of like as the page appears in a particular browser in a particular state, right? And so one thing that you can do to inspect or to look at the DOM is this, like browsers have these fancy developer tools built in. And so I can actually look at the code of any website. And maybe let me do this for a simple website. Let's take this one here. Here is like a simple website that we created, right? So this is a completely independent website. And now I can click inspect. And what I see here on the right is are the developer tools. And Chrome has this, Safari has this, Firefox has this, every browser has something like this, right? But generally, I think the Chrome and the Firefox developer tools are pretty good. They're not completely the same, but they kind of like have similar features. And so this, what you see here, which looks like HTML, is actually the DOM, right? So this here is the DOM. This is kind of like if we had programmatically generated a website, it would still look like this in here. We wouldn't see any JavaScript execution states or anything like that in here, right? This is kind of like what actually appears on the page. And the cool thing about this is that we can also, like, when we debug a website, we can simply say, hey, what did I do here? I can right-click on this element here, and I can say inspect. And it will actually jump to this particular like instance. What is actually responsible for this appearing here, right? And that's pretty cool. I could even go in and manipulate the DOM in here, and you would see it would actually change this. And that's like a nice way also of debugging something, right? And typically, like what the other thing that you see in the developer tools are the styles. And so there's no styling in here, so this is like slightly boring. But you can also manipulate styles in here dynamically to debug it, right? And then if you have JavaScript code, you can use the developer tools also to debug, right? To set breakpoints, to inspect variables, and so on. And then there's more fancy tools, like you can like analyze the performance of your program, and you can like see what are the resources pulling from and where are the delays coming in, and like what's the memory footprint and what's my local storage, and all of that is kind of available in the developer tools. But for now, just like remember that the key thing is that the DOM here is this representation of the document as it appears in the browser. The DOM is also an application programming interface, so an API of the browser, right? So the DOM exposes certain functions. So for example, I can add an element dynamically to the DOM through the DOM API. And we'll learn about this on Thursday. But for now, just like know that you can look at this. And also the other cool thing is that wherever you hover, you see immediately the visual representation, right? It tells you what is the element here. It's text area, hashtag, long text. Long text, the hashtag here means ID, which I'll talk about in a second. It gives you the dimension. It shows you the padding and the margin and all of those things with these little colors. And so this is like a very useful tool. Okay, any questions about this and about DOM versus HTML? Great. If not, here, like you can, the other way to access this, other than right-clicking, you can go to View, Developer, and then you can say Developer Tools, and that will open up this element. Okay, and there's some other developer tools in here as well. And there's like a link here that gives you a good overview of the dev tools by Chrome. By the way, for the homeworks, our reference browser is going to be Chrome. You can use, of course, any browser you like, but you have to make sure that it runs on Chrome. This is getting easier nowadays. Browsers are much more compatible. But if something doesn't work on Chrome, the TAs will be looking at your homework through Chrome. So just make sure it does work in Chrome. OK, great. So then let's move on to CSS, which is maybe a little bit more interesting. So CSS is kind of like the appearance pair. Like HTML gives the document its structure and its markup, and CSS controls the appearance. CSS stands for cascading style sheet. So it kind of like makes sense, style sheets and cascading, because they kind of like this, they apply in like nested cascading levels. And the other thing that I'm also going to teach here, which is like super related to CSS, but generally useful independent of CSS, are selectors. And so to access IDs and classes and elements, we can use certain types of selectors to retrieve them. And we can do this with CSS now, and that's what we were using it for. But we can use the same way of accessing these elements later with JavaScript. OK. So the style sheet can either be kind of like, well, it can be specified in many different ways. But one simple way of doing it is by specifying it within style tags in the HTML header. And I'll show the other ways at the end of the lecture. But for now, this is what I'll be using. And so here we have our head. And so this is like our document here. It looks very similar to what we had before, with the exception of that this text here is now like strong and it is blue, right? And so here I have specified in HTML, I've specified that this is strong, but I haven't said anything about it being blue, right? And so I do specify that it's blue by using CSS. And so this here is like our first CSS declaration, right? And so what we're saying here is within these style tags that are in the header, we say that a strong element should have the background color steel blue. That can be either one of the named HTML colors, or it can be a hex code, or it can also be some RGB value if you use like an RGB function. There's many ways now to specify colors. And then I'm specifying the font size. And the font size is supposed to be 150% of the usual font size. OK? And so what this does here is it looks for every element of type strong and applies this styling. And so, for example, if I were to do another paragraph here, then this wouldn't appear. But if I make this here strong, then this will actually also look like it, right? So like every element of type strong will be styled according to the rules that I've specified here in CSS. So far, so good. This is kind of like also our first selector. This is like an element selector. And element selectors are sometimes useful, but often they're not specific enough, right? Often I need to do something more specifics that it's useful. Yeah, so and the CSS that's within the curly brackets here, that's called the declaration, right? Notice that also, like, I have to terminate each of these lines with a semicolon. It's still going to work if you don't do it for the last one, but it actually might not work if you do it for an earlier one. So here you see that the blue actually didn't apply. So, like, always remember to add the semicolons to your CSS code. Okay. Yeah, I think we've covered this. So the other thing is that, of course, I can have conflicting declarations or nested cascading declarations. And then you have to kind of think about how do these rules apply. And the simple answer is that they apply in the order that they appear. But there's like slightly more complicated answer. For now, we'll just keep this the way it is. So like this here is like what I mean by this. I can have two different strong declarations. And they're like both, in this case, selecting the same element, but they are, they're just separated out. But the effect is the same as before. Like whether I write those two statements in one selector or in two selectors that match on the same element, it doesn't matter. Of course, this kind of like isn't particularly sensible here, so you shouldn't do something like this. But it could very well be that you have like, or it will very likely be the case that you have elements like multiple declarations apply to a single element. And we'll talk about this in just a second. Okay, so we had the element selector. So the next important selector is the CSS class selector. And so what we'll do here is kind of like see these kind of like text here in HTML. They basically look very much like we had them before. But notice that these class, like I've actually specified a class attribute here. And so this is like what this is all about, right? So the class selectors, they can be kind of like, they identify classes of a certain type. And I can specify the type of the class in this attribute. And so here I'm specifying 3 different types. I'm specifying important, I'm specifying footnote, and then I'm specifying one div here having both important and footnote, right? So this one here is not a new class that's called important footnote, but it means that this element is of type important and it is of type footnote. So it applies, both of them will apply. And then to, unlike for the elements earlier, where we just specified the name of the element, here we use the dot to specify a class selector. And this is like a very, very, very widespread and very often used convention, right? The dot identifies classes. Like dot important means I am matching everything of class important. And analogously, we'll later have the hashtag for the IDs, but this is the idea. No symbol at the beginning of this declaration means it's an element. A dot means it's a class. A hashtag means it's an ID, right? And so here I'm specifying important should be bold font, and then the footnotes should be smaller. And so those two are not kind of like in conflict, right? I can have something small and I can have something smaller. And so I can actually, like here, you see the important text is bold, and then here the footnote is small, and the important footnote is both bold and small. Okay, makes sense? Great. And then similarly, we have CSS ID selectors. And so the IDs, as I mentioned before, they should be unique to an element, but I can use them more or less the same way as I can use class selectors. So here I have an example, again, 3 lines of text. You have my diff ID first line, second line, and important. And I'm using kind of like the same syntax as before, except for the dot, I'm using the hashtag here to identify this ID. And generally, like you shouldn't do something like this here. Important seems more like a class, right? But say my toolbar is an ID because you might only have one toolbar, but important sounds more like a class. But generally, you can do this with an ID tag. The other thing that an ID tag can use is it's kind of like the anchor tag nowadays. So like if you look, for example, if you have like the website that we have here, this here is like a heading, and that heading, this is generated with like a tool. It's called Jackal, and this will automatically generate an ID here. So for example, this is the heading 2, and it has this ID CSS-ID-selectors. And so if I put this in here, I can say hashtag CSS-ID-selectors in the URL, and I would jump automatically to that part of the page, right? So I can jump to any part of a page that has an ID by adding it to the browser URL, right? So this is kind of like nice for deep linking into a document. Okay. Great. And the other thing, by the way, there's like many different things that you can do with CSS, right? Like you can change the fonts, you can change the font styling, you can change the background color, you can turn the text, and so on. I'm not going to teach you all of this stuff because this is super easy to look up, right? And again, like at the beginning of this page, there was like a link to the MDN docs where you can find like a reference for all of the different things that you can see. But essentially, like, you know, it's easy to Google MDN make font bold, right? And then you will get the right result. And so we don't have to go over all of these different options for styling stuff. Okay, so next, what you could do is you could use these combinations of IDs and CSS to create layouts of a page. And so this is kind of like an old way of doing a layout. But here I have a layout where I have like a menu on the left, which I'm showing this light blue block here with like a title and some like navigation. Then I have like my content, the main part in dark blue. And then I have some footer with some like address information or some links and so on at the bottom, right? So I could do this with CSS and with IDs. So here, like I start out with like in my body, I have my nav, which is like, this is kind of the element that I'm using because it's a navigation element, right? I have my home, paper, and students. Then I have my main. So this is the main content of the page. And I'm giving this all like an ID. Like this is ID sidebar, this is ID main, this is ID footer, right? And then we kind of pick up these elements in CSS and we specify it. Like the sidebar get 30% of the page, right? And so this is roughly what, or this is exactly what this is here, right? This is 30% of this page that's available from here to here. And then the height of this sidebar is 200 pixels. It floats to the right. Oh, no, this is the main, sorry. The sidebar here floats to the left, and it has this color. And the main element has 70% of the width. It has a height of 200 pixels. It floats to the right, and it has this steel blue background. And the footer is like at the bottom, so we don't have to specify any float, but we say it has 100% of the width, and it has like a green background color, right? So that's kind of like an old way of doing layouts, which you should probably not use anymore. But you know, in case you see it, I'll show you like a better way of doing layouts in just a minute. Okay, so we'll talk about CSS grid layouts in just a minute. So the next thing that gets like a little bit tricky, but is sometimes also useful, is CSS relationship selectors. So we now knew how to select individual elements. We knew how to select all elements. We knew how to select individual elements using with an ID or a certain type of elements based on a class. But now I can actually do some like logic. So for example, I could select all bold tags that are within the paragraph, or I could select all bold tags that are nested at some depth within the diff element. And this is sometimes also useful, like mainly also like very useful if you're web scraping, right? If you're trying to get to the content of a page programmatically, for example, using Python or something like this, you can use these relationship selectors to get to a specific element. They can also be useful in styling. So for example, here, I'm specifying a CSS child selector. So this means that only bold direct children of a paragraph element will match that query. And so let's look at this text here. So here's the result. So we see here we have a paragraph element, and directly within the paragraph element, we have a bold element, right? And that bold element here like matches exactly this color blue because it is directly a child. This next line here, we have a paragraph, then we have a span, and then we have another bold element. And this doesn't match. This doesn't appear blue here, right? So this is bold, but it's not blue. And it's not blue because this is really only direct children, not the grandkids or grand-grandkids of that element, right? So this isn't like the B is not directly nested in P, but there's not a level in between them. If I wanted to match that, I could use the Descendant Selector. So this means here, like I have the diff B and everything that is diff in a diff, and at some deeper level, whatever the level is in a B, that will show up as green. And so we have this here show up as green, and we can look at this here. So we have the diff, and then we have a span, and then we have a B, a bold, and that now applies because here, instead of using the direct descendant selector, we use this any descendant selector, right? So if I were to change this to this direct descendant, the green would go away. Okay, great. So let's talk a little bit more about multiple rules in CSS. So if you have more than rules in from a CSS specification match your code, this might be conflicting. And like, well, I said the order is kind of the most important one, but there's more to it. But it's also the most specific declaration wins. This is in practice. It's not. It doesn't like make natural sense. Like, what is the most specific declaration isn't necessarily always easy to understand, and the specification is pretty bad. And so, like, my recommendation would be, if you like see that you have applied multiple rules and somehow your styles don't take, is that you start debugging. So you break it up and you see, like, you can like open up the inspector and can kind of like remove some of the styling elements, and then suddenly something else might appear. So for example, let's take a look at this here. Let's open this up in a new page. And now we can inspect this. And now the interesting part is down here, and we can inspect this element. And now we see that we have the color blue defined here. And I can actually turn this off here so that I see what is the effect of this turning this off, right? Or I can also change this color here dynamically to red, and it will dynamically appear in red. Or I can like add new statements directly in here, and it will immediately appear in the website. Of course, this isn't going to change your code, right? This is just temporary for you to debug. This isn't stored anywhere, and it's completely volatile. Okay. And then one thing that's super useful, if you like, for example, one thing that's really hard to do if you think about it, if you have a table and you want to give it a zebra pattern, right? You want the first row to be dark gray, the second one to be light gray, so that it's like easy to trace the table. With standard tools, that would be actually quite hard, right? So you would have to write your code in such a way that you have a class that says odd row and a class that has even row. And that's kind of annoying because there must be an easier way of doing that. And the easier way is to use, for example, pseudo classes. And there's like many different pseudo classes. One other pseudo class is hoverable, like whether something can be hovered or if something has been visited. And so here's a couple of examples, right? So here in this paragraph, this text here is hoverable. So every time I hover over it, it changes its color. And then here is like we hover over an element. And then here I'm showing you like this, the link style. So for example, if I now open up this page, well, I open up this page here. But what I'm kind of want to show you here is, notice this was blue earlier, but now the browser has a record of it being visited. And now it applies a different style on top of it, right? So we have these other classes that are like inherent in the browser that we can use to do the styling. And down here we have this example of styling every nth element. And so let's look at these different declarations. So dot hoverable here is actually like, that's just a class name, right? That is actually nothing, not a pseudo class. This is just what I gave to this particular element here. So I call this span here hoverable. But the interesting thing is, like, first I essentially say the dot hoverable should be bold so that we can spot it. But then we have the dot hoverable colon hover, and now we specify what should happen on a hover. And on hover, we change the background color, and this is exactly what happens here. This bold text on hover, we change the background color, right? So when I hover with my mouse over that element of that class, then it will change the background color. We can also do this for elements. It doesn't have to be for classes. So here I'm doing the same thing for H2, which is exactly what is happening here, right? So the whole H2 element is being hovered. And then here is the link, like the A. We select all of the anchor tags, and we say for all the anchor tags that have been visited, we apply a different color. And then here, this is like the slightly trickier one. We have our list, and then we use the nth child pseudo class. And nth child takes a parameter, and it says like here, this is the first child, and that's kind of like our heading, right? So we can say by like taking this list, the first element in our list, they should get this background color cornflower blue. And then after that, every second child, to n child, should get the background color coral, right? And this is exactly what is happening here. And so if I were to add more elements here, notice that the list elements here don't have any style, but they will have kind of like alternating color because of this pseudo selector that I have created here with this rule of showing every nth element. Okay, any questions about this so far? Great. So now I want to talk a little bit about layouts. Layouts, always have been an issue in HTML. How do I create a nice page layout? In the early days, what was very common is to actually use a table and to lay out all the elements in a table. But that is kind of like tricky because tables are not super flexible. Then we did layouts with CSS, and then eventually there were frameworks popping up, like additional libraries that would give you things like columns and rows that are easily configurable. And that was really actually nice, right? This was for the first time a way of doing these layouts nicely. And then the HTML and CSS standardization committee has realized that there's something missing from the HTML and CSS specification and has kind of like learned from these many different libraries. And they have created the CSS Grid Layout. And the CSS Grid Layout is like one of the ways that you can create layouts, but I think it's like probably like a very good layout method to start. And so what do we want to do with layouts? So like I'm going to jump a little bit ahead and show you what the end result of what we want to do here is. So we want to create a page like this, where we have a header, then we have maybe two views. These could be visualizations. Then we have like a sidebar. Here could be some meta information, some text that we want to provide about these visualizations. And then we have a footer bar here. And notice that this is like actually would be fairly hard to do with a table because it kind of uses some grids, but it does break, it doesn't neatly align like a cell is that and a cell is that, right? So we have this header here that spreads over 3 columns. This here spreads over 2 rows. This here goes over 2 columns and so on. And so like this is a fairly common layout for a website, right? But it's actually not completely intuitive in how I would create this. And I would dare you to try to do this with floats alone, right? That would be pretty horrible. But it's like actually fairly easy to do with these grid layouts. And then actually the next step that we'll be looking at is a nested layout. So for example, here we have in the header, we have another layout that has buttons in it, right? So that's kind of like the end goal of the next whatever 20 minutes that we'll be looking at. And let's just take this apart step by step. Okay. So the CSS Grid Layout is this kind of like modern way of laying out content on a web page. It's part of standard CSS. And like basically what we do here is anything that we want to wrap inside this grid layout, we wrap within, for example, a diff element that has the style display grid. This is kind of like this declaration here. And I have this wrapper here. It says display grid. And this wrapper here, we have our very simple HTML here. We have our diff that has this wrapper class. And then we have like the nav with the header, then 2 divs with the view. Then we have an A side with our sidebar. And then we have the footer here, which contains the text footer. We close the div, we close the body. That's it, right? So the HTML here is super simple. And then if we, like in this wrapper here, I'm simply saying display grid. And then I'm also saying gap 10 pixels. This is something that you might want to use or might not want to use. For debugging, it's nice, right? Because then we have these elements nicely spread out. And so then I also have some definitions here for the various elements. So for nav, it's orange, and this is really just colors, right? So I'm not doing anything specific to the grid here, but all of these elements are now already laid out by the grids. They would look exactly the same if I didn't use a grid except for the spacing, but they are already in the grids. And so now we can look at what we can do with that grid. So in this next example, what we'll do is we'll create these columns. And so we'll create 3 columns, and then we'll arrange these elements in these columns. And I can do that by, like, in this wrapper, specifying grid template columns. And so here I'm saying 200 pixels, 200 pixels, 200 pixels. And what that means is I want 3 columns that are exactly 200 pixels wide, right? So that kind of like makes intuitively sense. And what happens is that the columns here are enforced, and all the other, like, and the rows here are actually auto-generated, right? So I haven't specified how the rows are supposed to be looking. I haven't specified on which element should go into which cell of the grid. And so what it is just it takes the first 3 elements, puts them in the first row in the 3 different columns, and then if there's a 4th element, it goes to the next row. And so that's already a little bit of progress, but not super exciting, right? So one thing that we want to do is, like, here I've used pixels, and pixels are sometimes nice, but they're not always great, right? Because pixels are this like static measure, and like I might want to have, like, want to use the full screen of a page, or I might want to use specific, like, partitions of it. And I could use percentages, but percentages are kind of like not so nice because I always have to update them, right? If I later decide, like, if I have 25% times 4, and I later decide, oh, I need a 5th column, then I need to change all of my percentage declarations, right? And the solution to this problem are fractions. And fractions are this new unit that were introduced with the grid layout. And I can do this, and I can mix this. I can say my grid template columns should look like 150 pixels for the first column, 2 fractions for the second column, and then 1 fraction for the third column. And so what that means is the grid layout will take the whole space it has available, take the first 150 pixels away. That's reserved for the first column. And then it would look at the remaining space, and it will divide it 2 to 1. It will do this math automatically, right? There are 3 fractions being used, and 2 of them, 2/3 of the remaining space will go to the second column, and 1/3 of the remaining space will go to the third column. And so this is the result here, which is kind of like starting to look a little bit more interesting, right? So we have our static stuff here, and then we have the 2/3, and then we have the 1/3. And so if I were to change this, for example, to 3 fractions here, I would get like a completely different layout, right? And now I've like moved the static pixel assignment, but given the 3, 2, 1, and it's done all of the math automatically. Yes. Just wide, because I am actually specifying columns here. We can do the same thing with rows. I'll talk about this in a minute. But because we are specifying columns, we only talk about the width of the columns, not the height of the columns. That's how we specify the rows. Any other questions? Okay. Great. So so by default, rows are set to be part of this implicit grid here. Like I haven't specified how rows should look at all, right? But they still appeared. So we can, of course, like we control our columns, we can control our rows. And as for, like, we had these grid template columns, and we can use grid template rows, or we can also use grid auto rows. And so, like, if the grid auto rows are useful, like, if we have floating content. So, for example, if you have something like Facebook or Twitter, where you have, like, infinite scrolling, then you might want to use auto rows, and they are often useful. But if you have an exact, precise layout where you want to control, I have this many rows, then you would use the grid template rows. Okay, and so here I'm specifying now my grid template rows, and I'm using 200 pixels, 200 pixels, 200 pixels again. And now the rows actually have exactly 200 pixels, right? And I don't actually have a third row here, but if I were to add more elements, this should appear. So you see, all of this has appeared. Okay, and so this is like basically we didn't do anything exciting or anything new here, and we had like 1 fractions here for the columns. Great. So the interesting part now starts. What? Yeah. No, you can specify as much as you want. Typically, if you specify more than a handful, you use some auto specification, so some repeat. I'll show you this a little bit later. Like that, you say, for example, I have on my left column has 150 pixels. Then I have 50 columns that all have one fraction, and then you can specify this with a repeat command, and then you have maybe something at the end. Yeah. Sure, 2FR here. So makes sense, right? We have now the one element at the far right, the fourth column here, is twice as wide as all of the other columns here. Great. So now let's take a look at how can we actually do this, right? How can we make something appear from here to here? And to do that, it's actually fairly simple. The only new concept that we have to learn about is lines. And so we have column lines and we have row lines. And if we look at this layout that we had here earlier, we can very easily like specify what are the lines. So here, this line here that I drew would be like our column line number 1. This here would be our column line number 2, column line number 3, column line number 4. Notice we don't start at 0, we start at 1, right? And so now I guess it's pretty obvious what happens next. If I say I want an element to go from line 1 to 2, it would be exactly that element. If I want an element to go from line 1 to 3, it would be a combined element for those two here. If I want an element to go from 1 to 4, it would be exactly that element. Okay, I can also say like from 4 to -2, like go 2 back, and so on. There's this kind of like Python-y grammar built in here as well. And then there's there's 2 ways of specifying this. I can do a grid column start and grid column end, or I can use this syntax here, grid column 2/4. That means go from 2 to 4, right? So either very explicit with grid column start, grid column end, or with this shorthand notation, grid column goes from 2 to 4. And so what we do here is for the nav, which is our navigation at the top, we say this goes from grid column start 1 to 4. And then for the A side, this is supposed to be kind of the right side. We say it goes from 3 to 4. But what's also interesting here, we don't want this to be appearing at all in the first row. So this is supposed, and like I didn't mention this explicitly, but yes, I have column row lines and I also have row lines, right? So this would be row line number 1, row line number 2. And I can use the specification either 4 columns or 4 lines. Okay, so here we have this A side that starts at row 2 and goes to row 4. And for our footer, that is like here we use the shorthand from 1 to 3 with this 1/3. And that's kind of like the result of this, right? And now we have created this nice and neat layout. So I think this is pretty cool. And these grid layouts make something like this fairly easy. What is also nice is that, again, the developer tools are pretty good at supporting this. And so we can look at this. Sorry, what's it? We can look at this here and inspect. And what you will see is like our diff class here says grid, right? And if I click that grid element, it's like a little hard to see here because that zoom doesn't apply. Looks like it, yeah. The zoom doesn't apply to the labels. But like you can probably guess there's these little numbers here, and those are the lines, right? So you have the column lines and the row lines, and if you have created some complicated, maybe unintentionally created some complicated grid, you can look at where are my lines using this inspector so that you can specify this neatly. You can also see here, this is line -1, which already tells you, like I can actually reach that line by specifying -1. And similarly for the rows, we have here line -4 and like line -3 and so on. Okay. Cool. So now, typically, like, when we create something more complicated, we do want to nest layouts, right? So for example, we want our overall page layout to be done with grids. but then we might want to have a toolbar, and that toolbar itself we also want to lay out. And so we can do this easily with these grid layouts by simply like creating like a nested element and by having two separate grid layouts. And so here's actually a bug. This should be a diff. Anyways, this doesn't matter. So what we have here is we have our header, and in that header, like this all like the whole page is again part of our wrapper. And then in our nav header, we have another class that we call toolbar, and in that we have the buttons. And so everything else here is laid out the same. Like all of this stuff is just copied from what we had before, but this here is new. So here we introduce this new class for the toolbar, and now we have another grid layout here. And now we like, because these are buttons, right? And there might be many of them. I'm now using this repeat syntax that I talked about earlier. I say grid template columns repeat 4 times 60 pixels, right? And so I have specified here, I want 4 columns, and each of them are supposed to be 60 pixels wide, right? I could do equally, like, 6 over 60, and then I would have my 6 buttons here next to each other. But I can do 3 or 2, and then I would get this like stacked up like this, right? Okay, so all of this is very simple, and I actually like this layout here is super simple. This is really just a demonstration of I can do these nested layouts. Great. So that's all I wanted to say about grids. Grids can get a little bit more subtle, and there's other ways of doing layouts. I do recommend that you take a look at this MDN tutorial. But for the purposes of what you'll be doing in the projects or in the homeworks, like what I taught you here should be sufficient for grid layouts. But as I said, there's like a little bit more to it if you really want to dive into that. Okay, so let's take a step back. So far, we've always had this, every file that I showed here is completely self-contained. We have the style declaration in here that we where all of this stuff is happening. This is kind of nice because I can show you like a fully contained file. But in practice, in a bigger project, you would actually move this to separate files, right? Like you would have a file with styles, you would have a file with JavaScript, you would have a file with HTML. So that's fairly common. And this is kind of like the way how we would do that. So we could use this rel style sheet and then href style.css, and we would store the styles in the style.css files. This other thing we can do, which is kind of like ugly if you do it directly in HTML, but it's actually okay to do if you do it programmatically. You can directly style elements, right? So I can, for example, here I don't have a style sheet. I don't have even like a template or a header or anything like that. I simply have a paragraph that has a bold section, and in that bold section, I have an attribute that's called style, and I'm specifying CSS in here, right? So this is okay to do, and that's sometimes useful, if you just want to see how something looks like. Generally, like you might want to, like if you write HTML, you want to give this be a class and then have a CSS specification, because then you can reuse it, right? Then you can use it in many different cases. But it might also be that you have some other way of applying this style, for example, with JavaScript. So this B might have an identifier or a class, and you might like inject this style here programmatically with JavaScript. And that's actually fairly common and also okay, right? This is programmatically generated, it doesn't hurt. So there's no problem with this if you do it programmatically. So this is the third way of specifying CSS. Okay. So that's all I wanted to say about CSS. Any questions about HTML or CSS? Yeah. This is like a legacy page that is older than Grid. So it's done with something different. But if I did it now, I would use grids, right? Basically, what's common nowadays is to use either grids or to use some like styling library, like Material UI or something like that, right? That has other stuff built in, and then you can either use the Material grid layouts or use this standard grid layout. I think the standard grid layout is becoming probably more common because everything that's standardized is nice, right? You don't have to load extra files and so on. The which plot? The toolbar. This one here. So the what part? Like this is really just a nested element, right? So well, let's inspect this. So we can this is what this looks like. And now what we have here is two different grids, right? We have one top level grid that does the whole page layout, and then one lower level grid that does the toolbar. And this is actually not buttons, right? These are just elements. And I made a little, I added a nice little hover so that I can see that these are supposed to be buttons. They don't do anything, but I could add a link here, right, or some action at a later time. And now if I inspect this, I can look at my overall grid. Like you see the diff. Now, let me zoom out a bit so we see this better. So this is my overall grid, right? This is the grid that I use to style that page. And you can see that my menu here crosses the 3 columns. And then on the second level, I have the second grid. And the second grid here is much smaller, and that only applies to these little buttons here, right? And so this grid here is specified in the styles here. Like I first have my top level grid, and then I have my nested grid. Where is it? Here's my nested grid. So my dot toolbar, like this is the toolbar class, like the toolbar element with the class toolbar that has these buttons in it, and that's kind of like what's being what the layout is applying to here. And the other thing that's noticeable about the nested grids, they kind of use the space they're allocated, right? So if I in this case here, if I had if I did a nested grid and this would only be this wide, and I gave it 2 FRs, it would divide up that space, right, of its parent element. It wouldn't take the whole page like we had earlier, but it would take only the space that its parent element has. Yeah, other questions? Okay, great. So yeah, so we're kind of 8 minutes out from the end of class. I'm not gonna rush through Git and GitHub. Who has used Git or in GitHub? No, maybe let's ask the other way around again. Sorry. Who has not used Git and GitHub before? Okay. So it seems like I don't actually have to teach this because most people have actually done this already. So basically, you won't need it all that much for the homeworks, right? You will need it mostly to kind of see the latest homeworks on GitHub, but you can also, if you haven't done this before, if you go to GitHub, to the database course page, and it loads, and I'm looking at the homeworks here. Essentially, there's 2 ways of getting the homeworks, right? There's the one way, the simple way is download zip file. That's kind of then you simply can download it, right? You have it on your computer. You can do whatever you want with it, or you can actually get the GitHub and clone it with Git. And there's a tutorial on the page that you can see how to do that. For the homeworks, it doesn't really matter. We recommend that you also use, for example, a private GitHub repository to store the work in progress that you have on your own homeworks. And I give you a nice example in this tutorial on how you can pull from our repository and still push to your own private repository in GitHub and get all of this nicely in sync. But what you really will need GitHub for is your project, right? When you later collaborate in a team, you will set up a shared repository on GitHub with your teammates, and you will kind of work together on the code. And you might do things like maybe even pull requests to have some people review your code. But this stuff is explained in this tutorial. I'm not going to rush through it because it will take me way more than 5 minutes. And so I'll rather end the class early for 5 minutes today. I'm happy to take any questions if you still have some. You're welcome to come down and ask me, or yeah. See you all on Thursday, and we'll talk about JavaScript and Basics D3.